Marlene Kowalczyk was 68 years old, and for 41 of those years, she believed one thing, without question, that if you gave your whole self to a place, that place remembered you. She'd swept the concrete floors of Redhawk Logistics before the sun came up. She'd trained 3 generations of forklift drivers. She'd known every dent in every loading bay door by heart. So when her supervisor called her into a glass-walled office on a Tuesday morning and told her she was being let go for slowing down, she almost laughed. Then she realized he meant it. What Dale Prescott didn't know, what he was too new and too arrogant to ever think to check, was that the warehouse he managed didn't belong to the company he worked for. It belonged to her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is Second Wind Stories, and today's story is about what happens when the people who think they're in charge have no idea who's actually holding the deed. If you've ever been written off because of your age, if you've watched someone younger walk in and treat your experience like an inconvenience, stay with us. Marlene's story is the kind that makes you want to stand up and cheer by the end, and we think you're going to need to hear it. Let's go back to where it started, because to understand what Dale Prescott lost that Tuesday morning, you have to understand what Marlene Kowalczyk actually built. Thornberry, Ohio wasn't the kind of place people moved to. It was the kind of place people were from, a town of about 9,000 people wrapped around a rail line and a stretch of Route 9 that used to matter more than it did now. Marlene grew up there, married there, and in 1983, at 27 years old, she and her husband Anton signed a loan they couldn't really afford for a half-collapsed grain building on the edge of town. Anton had a plan. Marlene had the stubbornness to make sure the plan didn't fall apart. Anton Kowalczyk was a big man with a bigger laugh, the kind of person who remembered the name of every trucker's kid and every driver's dog. He'd worked freight for 15 years before he decided he was done making money for someone else's company. He wanted his own outfit, something small, something honest, something that paid people fairly and treated the work like it mattered. Marlene believed in him before the bank did. The first 2 years nearly broke them. They ran the place with 4 employees and a payroll that Marlene did by hand at the kitchen table, some weeks paying the drivers before she paid herself. She learned the business from the ground floor up. Not because anyone taught her, because nobody else was going to do it. By 1987, Redhawk Logistics had 11 employees and a contract with a regional grocery distributor that changed everything. For the next 20 years, Marlene worked every job the warehouse needed. Office manager, dispatcher, on more than one snowed in December, forklift driver. She and Anton built something out of a collapsing grain building that fed families across 3 counties, and she never once thought of it as his company and her support system. It was theirs, every inch of it. Then, in 2009, Anton got sick. It moved fast, faster than either of them expected, and by the time the lawyers were finished with the estate paperwork, the business Marlene had spent half her life building looked, on paper, nothing like it once had. A regional logistics group had already approached Anton 2 years earlier about buying in. What Marlene didn't fully grasp at the time, grieving and exhausted and signing documents an attorney kept sliding in front of her, was that Anton had made sure one thing never changed hands. The land, the building, the physical warehouse itself stayed in a family trust, with Marlene as the sole controlling beneficiary, completely separate from the operating company that would come to run day-to-day business inside it. She kept working there anyway, not because she needed the money, because it was the only place that had ever felt like home, and because some habits outlast the reasons you started them. Nobody at the corporate level ever asked who owned the physical property their warehouse sat on. Why would they? It was just a line item, a lease agreement renewed automatically every year, paid to a trust with a name that meant nothing to anyone reading it. Marlene showed up at 6 in the morning in the same steel-toed boots she'd worn for 2 decades. And to every manager who rotated through over the following 15 years, she was just Mrs. K from receiving. Reliable. A little slow these days, some of them started saying behind her back. Old-fashioned. Due for retirement. Dale Prescott had been one of those managers for 8 months when he decided she was the problem. Dale Prescott was 43 years old, and he'd spent the better part of his career believing that efficiency was a personality trait. He'd come up through corporate operations at two other logistics firms before Ashford Regional Holdings transferred him to Thornberry, and he arrived with a laptop full of spreadsheets and a habit of using the word optimize in almost every sentence. He'd never run a warehouse floor a day in his life. He'd managed people who ran warehouse floors, which in his mind amounted to the same thing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first time Dale met Marlene, he shook her hand for exactly 2 seconds and asked her how long she'd been helping out at Redhawk. Helping out. 41 years of building the place, and a man half her age assumed she was a volunteer. Marlene corrected him, gently, the way she corrected most things. She told him she'd been there since before the building had a working roof. Dale smiled the smile of someone who wasn't really listening and moved on to ask a younger employee about the inventory software. It wasn't one incident that told Marlene where things were headed. It was a pattern, slow and cumulative, the kind of thing you don't fully notice until you add it up months later. Dale stopped inviting her to morning huddles, then started them 10 minutes earlier than the posted time, so she'd walk in halfway through. He'd repeat instructions to her twice, loudly, the way people talk to someone they've decided can't keep up, even though she'd never once needed anything repeated. When a new scanning system came in, he assigned a 24-year-old to train her on it in front of the whole receiving team, as if she hadn't trained half that team herself a decade earlier. Priya Bhatt noticed before anyone else did. Priya had come to Redhawk 9 years earlier as a temp worker fresh out of the logistics certificate program, and Marlene had been the one who'd shown her how to run a manifest without losing her mind. Priya was floor supervisor now, 34 years old, sharp enough that even Dale mostly left her alone. She started keeping an eye on how Dale talked to Marlene the way you'd watch weather rolling in. He does it to make himself feel like he's in charge, Priya told her once in the break room, after Dale had spent a solid 5 minutes explaining a shipping manifest process to Marlene that she designed herself in 1994. It's not about you being slow. You're the only person here who makes him feel small. Marlene laughed it off, mostly because laughing it off was easier than the alternative. She'd survived plenty in her life. A husband's death, a business nearly going under twice. She figured she could survive one more manager with something to prove. What she didn't account for was how long 8 months of daily erosion could wear on a person, even a person who genuinely loved the work. By the 4th month, Dale had started documenting things. Small things. A 10-minute lull between trucks where he'd note she'd been unproductive. A misstep count on a shift he claimed was below expectation, though every warehouse worker over 60 routinely fell under whatever benchmark the software had been calibrated for. He wasn't building a case out of malice, not exactly. He genuinely believed what he was doing was rational. In his mind, Redhawk's numbers had been soft for a year. Corporate was breathing down his neck about regional efficiency scores, and somewhere in his spreadsheets, Marlene Kowalczyk's name kept appearing next to metrics that made him look bad. He never once asked why an employee with 4 decades of tenure was still working receiving shifts at 68 years old instead of running the place, or owning it, or having retired to Florida a long time ago. It never occurred to him to wonder. People like Dale rarely wonder about the people they've already decided don't matter. The regional VP, Corwin Ash, backed Dale from the start. Corwin had approved the hire, had staked some of his own reputation on Dale, turning around a facility that corporate considered underperforming relative to its size, and he wasn't in the habit of second-guessing his own picks. When Dale floated the idea of restructuring the receiving team for efficiency, Corwin didn't ask a single question about who specifically that meant. He just told Dale to handle it the way he saw fit and to keep the paperwork clean. Denise Falk in HR handled paperwork the way most people handle a to-do list, which is to say without much thought for what any individual line actually cost a person. She'd process what Dale sent her. She always did. Marlene had no idea any of this was happening. She kept coming in at 6, kept training the newer hires when Dale wasn't around to make a spectacle, kept doing the job she loved in the building her husband had bled for, and she had bled for right alongside him. She had survived worse than a condescending 43-year-old with a laptop. She just didn't know yet that he was already building the file that would end it. There's a particular kind of cruelty that doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It shows up in emails marked routine. It shows up in performance software nobody remembers agreeing to. By the 6th month of Dale's tenure at Redhawk, that was the kind of cruelty Marlene was living inside, and she still didn't have a name for it. The scanning software Dale had installed tracked everything. Steps per hour, pallets moved per shift, time between scans, time between breaks, time standing still. It had been sold to Ashford Regional as a tool for spotting bottlenecks in the supply chain. In Dale's hands, it became something closer to a stopwatch pointed at one person. He pulled Marlene's numbers weekly. He never pulled anyone else's with the same frequency, though he would have told you, if asked, that he reviewed everyone's data equally. He believed that. It just wasn't true. What the software couldn't measure was the 20 minutes Marlene spent most mornings walking a new hire through the manifest system nobody had properly documented since she'd built it by hand 30 years earlier. It couldn't measure the fact that she still knew, by memory, which loading bay door stuck in cold weather and needed an extra shove, saving the crew 10 minutes every single frigid morning that Dale's software would have registered as her being idle. It couldn't measure the 2 truckers who requested her specifically for freight pickups, because she was the only person left who remembered how their accounts used to run before 3 different companies bought and resold the contract. Efficiency software measures motion. It has never once measured knowledge. Priya tried twice to explain some of this to Dale directly. The first time, in a hallway near the break room, she told him that Marlene's slower pace on paper reflected training time that benefited the whole floor, not a decline in ability. Dale nodded along, said he appreciated the context, and changed nothing. The second time, a month later, Priya was more direct. She told him flatly that if he pulled Marlene off the floor, 3 of the newer hires would lose the only person who actually knew how the older accounts worked. Dale said he'd take it under advisement. He did not take it under advisement. He filed the conversation, mentally, as Priya being overly attached to a coworker, which made her opinion easier for him to discount. Marlene noticed the shift in how people talked to her that fall. Not unkindly, exactly. Carefully. The way people talk around someone they've quietly decided is fragile. A new 22-year-old hire, sweet enough, once asked her if she needed help lifting a case of canned goods that weighed maybe 8 pounds. Marlene had lifted 40-pound cases solo for 4 decades. She said no thank you and carried it herself. And something in her chest tightened in a way she didn't examine too closely, because examining it meant admitting how much it stung. She started, without fully deciding to, working a little harder to prove herself. Coming in 10 minutes earlier. Skipping her afternoon break twice a week to finish a manifest ahead of schedule. It's a particular trap, the instinct to overperform for people who've already made up their minds about you. And Marlene fell into it the way most people do, quietly and without noticing until much later how tired it had made her. In November, Dale compiled what he called a performance summary for corporate review. It listed Marlene's step counts against a benchmark average, her break patterns against a standard shift model, and a section labeled engagement concerns that cited 2 instances of her being observed standing near the loading dock without an active task, both of which had actually been moments she'd spent talking a rattled new driver through his first icy road pickup. Dale didn't include that context. He didn't ask for it. The report went to Corwin Ash with a recommendation attached. Workforce restructuring, receiving department, effective immediately. Corwin read it in about 90 seconds between 2 other meetings. He didn't call Thornberry to ask a single follow-up question. He typed back 1 line. Approved, handle with standard severance terms, keep it clean. Denise Falk received a forwarded copy an hour later and began drafting the termination paperwork the same afternoon, filling in a template she'd used probably 200 times before, changing only the name and the date. None of them knew Marlene Kowalczyk's name meant anything beyond the line item on a payroll sheet. None of them had ever bothered to find out. They were about to fire the one person in the building who technically had the authority to fire all 3 of them, and not one of them had the faintest idea. The termination meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 9 in the morning, in the glass-walled office that used to be Anton's. Marlene knew something was wrong the moment she saw the meeting invite on the shared calendar Thursday afternoon. Dale rarely scheduled one-on-ones. When he did, they lasted 5 minutes and covered nothing that couldn't have been said over the radio on the floor. This one was blocked for 30 minutes, and Denise Fox's name was listed as a second attendee. Marlene had worked in enough offices over enough decades to know what it meant when HR sat in on a meeting with your manager. She didn't sleep well that weekend. She told herself it was nothing. She'd told herself that before, about other things, and she'd usually been wrong. Tuesday morning, she got to Redhawk at her usual time, 6 a.m., and worked her shift like any other. She trained a new hire on the manifest system one more time, walked the loading dock, checked the stuck door in Bay 4 out of habit, even though the weather had been mild. At 8:45, she washed the grease off her hands, took off her work gloves, and walked to the glass-walled office at the far end of the building. It had been Anton's office once, back when the walls were still cinder block and the desk was a door propped on 2 filing cabinets. It didn't look anything like that anymore. Corporate had remodeled it 3 managers ago. Dale was already seated when she walked in, a manila folder squared neatly in front of him on the desk. Denise sat to his right with a laptop open and an expression arranged into something professionally neutral. Neither of them stood up. "Marlene, thanks for coming in," Dale said, the way he might open a meeting about quarterly targets. "Have a seat." She sat. She didn't say anything. 41 years had taught her that silence usually told you more than filling it did. Dale opened the folder, though Marlene got the sense he already knew everything in it by heart. He talked about performance benchmarks. He talked about step counts and break patterns and something called an engagement index that Marlene had never heard of and that no one had ever explained to her. He used the word restructuring twice. He used the word unfortunately once, in the flat tone of someone reading it off a script rather than feeling it. At this point, Dale said, "We think it's best for the department if we make some changes to the receiving team. Given some of the patterns we've been seeing, and honestly, given some of the demands of the role as it's evolved, we've decided to let you go." Marlene felt the words land somewhere behind her ribs before her mind had fully processed them. "Some of the demands of the role," she repeated. "The pace of the floor has changed a lot," Dale said, and here, for the first time, something like discomfort crossed his face, though it didn't slow him down. "We need people who can keep up with current volume expectations. It's not a reflection on your history here. It's just things have gotten faster than they used to be, and we need the team to reflect that." "You mean I'm slowing down?" Marlene said. Dale didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer. Denise slid a folder across the desk, severance paperwork, a final paycheck breakdown, a form releasing the company from further obligation that Marlene would need to sign before the end of the week to receive the standard 2 weeks of pay. "We really do appreciate everything you've contributed," Dale added, the sentence arriving like an afterthought bolted onto the end of something already decided. "This isn't easy for us either." Marlene looked at him for a long moment. 41 years. She'd swept this floor when it was still bare concrete with no drainage. She'd carried payroll in an envelope to the bank on foot the year they couldn't afford a second vehicle. She'd held Anton's hand in a hospital room and come back to work 3 days after the funeral because there was nowhere else she wanted to be. And a man who'd been in the building for 8 months was telling her the pace had gotten too fast for her. She thought briefly about telling him, about the trust, about the deed sitting in a filing cabinet in Gerald Whitlock's office 40 minutes away, with her name on every line that mattered. She thought about watching his face change in real time. Some tired, stubborn part of her almost wanted to. She didn't. Not because she was afraid. Because some part of her, even in that moment, wanted to see how far he'd go without knowing. "I understand," she said instead, and stood up and picked up the folder and walked out of the office that used to have Anton's handwriting still faintly visible under a coat of paint on the doorframe, where he'd once measured how tall Marlene had gotten in her first year of pregnancy with their daughter, a mark nobody currently working at Redhawk even knew was there. Priya saw her walking toward the parking lot with the folder under her arm and knew immediately what had happened. She didn't say anything. She just walked out with her, past the loading docks, past the trucks Marlene had once dispatched by hand, and stood with her in the cold November air, while Marlene tried to remember how to breathe normally again. "They have no idea what they just did," Priya finally said. Marlene let out a short, humorless laugh. "No," she said, "they really don't. Grief has a way of returning in layers you don't expect." And the week after Marlene lost her job, she found herself thinking about Anton more than she had in years. Not the funeral, not the hospital. She thought about the two of them standing in the empty grain building in 1983, looking up at a roof with 3 separate holes in it, and Anton saying, half joking, half not, that someday this place would take care of them both. She believed him. She still did, technically, in the part of her mind that hadn't caught up yet to what had just happened. But belief and feeling are different animals, and what she felt, mostly in that first week, was that she'd been thrown away. She didn't tell anyone about the trust. Not her daughter, who called from Columbus twice that week, sounding worried in a way Marlene tried to wave off. Not Priya, who kept texting to check in and got short, deflecting replies. It wasn't that Marlene had forgotten what she owned. It was that some tangled, stubborn part of her didn't want the truth of it to erase what she was feeling, which was smaller and rawer than any legal document could touch. She wanted to sit, for a little while, in the fact that a man half her age had looked her in the eye and called 41 years slowing down. The nights were the worst part. She'd wake at 4, the hour she'd normally have been getting ready for a shift, and lie in the dark of the house she and Anton had bought in 1989, running through the math of a life she no longer had. Social Security covered the basics, barely. Her savings were modest, the kind of modest that comes from spending 3 decades reinvesting whatever extra the business made instead of building a private nest egg for herself. In the parts of her mind that hadn't yet remembered the trust, or that refused to let it comfort her, she ran through worst-case scenarios the way anyone would. Would she need to sell the house? Would her daughter end up supporting her? Was 68 too old for anyone to hire her for anything? And the ugly answer her mind kept supplying was probably. She drove past the warehouse once, for days after the firing, on her way to the pharmacy. She didn't mean to. Her hands just turned the wheel the way they had 10,000 times before. She sat in the car across the street for a full 10 minutes, watching trucks pull in and out of the bay doors, watching a stranger's silhouette move through the glass-walled office at the far end of the building, and felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not quite grief, not quite rage, something that lived in the space between the two. Gerald Whitlock called her that Friday. He'd handled the trust paperwork for Anton back in 2009, had renewed the lease agreement with Ashford Regional every year since without much fanfare, and he'd heard through Priya, who knew Gerald's daughter from high school, that Marlene had been let go. "I think it's time we talked," Gerald said on the phone, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words. "There are some things about the property you might want to revisit. Some of it, frankly, I think you've forgotten you have." Marlene told him she'd come by Monday. She wasn't ready yet. She spent the weekend doing the small, aimless tasks of someone whose days no longer had a shape to them. She cleaned a kitchen that didn't need cleaning. She sat on the back porch in the cold and looked at a photo of Anton from 1985, grinning next to the first truck they'd ever owned outright, no bank holding any part of it. Her daughter drove up from Columbus that Sunday, worried enough to skip her own plans. She sat across the kitchen table from her mother and asked, gently, what she was going to do. "I don't know yet," Marlene admitted, and it was the first fully honest thing she'd said out loud since the firing. "I keep thinking about your father, about what he'd say if he saw how they talked to me in there." Her daughter reached across the table and took her hand. "He'd probably say you already know what to do. You're just being stubborn about getting there." Marlene laughed for the first time in a week, a Rayal laugh, short and surprised out of her. That does sound like him. That night, after her daughter had gone home, Marlene sat at the kitchen table with the folder Denise had given her, the severance paperwork still unsigned. She looked at it for a long time. Then she set it aside, walked into the small back room she still used as an office, and pulled out an old cardboard box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were copies of documents from 2009, deed transfers, trust filings, letters from Gerald with legal language she'd barely skimmed at the time because she'd been too raw with grief to focus on anything. She sat there past midnight, reading it all again with clearer eyes than she'd had 15 years earlier. By the time she finally went to bed, something in her had shifted. Not healed, not yet, but shifted. Monday morning, she called Gerald back and told him she was ready to talk. Gerald Whitlock's office sat above a hardware store on Thornberry's Main Street. 2 rooms with wood paneling that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration and a window unit that rattled even in November. Marlene had been there exactly 3 times in 15 years, all 3 around the anniversary of Anton's death, when Gerald needed a signature renewing something routine. She'd never really looked closely at what she was signing. Grief does that to a person. It makes paperwork feel like background noise to a much louder grief happening in your chest. This time she read every page. Gerald pulled a thick file from a cabinet behind his desk, the kind of file that had clearly been maintained and updated for over a decade, and set it in front of her with the careful precision of a man who'd been waiting a long time to have this conversation properly. Anton set this up in the spring of 2009, he said, before he got sick. He came to me with a plan that, frankly, I thought was a little dramatic at the time. I told him so. He didn't care. The plan, as Gerald laid it out, was simple in structure and almost absurd in its foresight. When Ashford Regional Holdings approached Anton about acquiring a controlling stake in Redhawk Logistics as an operating company, Anton had agreed, but only on the condition that the land and the physical warehouse itself never transferred with it. He split the 2 apart deliberately. Ashford would own and run the business that operated inside the building, the trucks, the contracts, the payroll, all of it. But the building and the 62 acres it sat on would remain in a family trust, with Marlene named as the sole controlling beneficiary, collecting a lease payment from Ashford every single year for the privilege of running their operation on land they didn't own. He told me, Gerald said, and I remember this almost word for word, that companies get bought and sold and run into the ground by people who never built them. He said the one thing he could make sure of was that no matter what happened to Redhawk as a business, you'd never lose the ground under it. He said if anyone ever tried to push you out of that place, you'd own the floor they were standing on. Marlene sat with that for a moment, her hands flat on the desk. He never told me any of this. He meant to, Gerald said. He got sick faster than either of you expected. I think he assumed there'd be time to sit you down and walk you through it properly. There wasn't. So I've just kept renewing the lease every year, quietly, the way he set it up. Nobody at Ashford has ever asked who's behind the trust. Why would they? It's just a line item to them. He slid a document across the desk, the current lease agreement, the one Dale Prescott's employer paid every year without a second thought. Marlene's name wasn't on it directly. The trust name was a deliberately unremarkable string of words Anton had chosen specifically so it wouldn't draw attention. But beneath it, in the trustee documentation, her name was listed clearly as the sole controlling party with full authority to renew, terminate, or renegotiate the lease at will. You could end their lease tomorrow if you wanted, Gerald said. You could raise the rate high enough to make it painful. You could sell the property out from under them to someone else entirely. Legally, you hold every card. They just don't know it. Marlene laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and then found herself blinking back tears she hadn't expected. It wasn't relief, exactly, though relief was part of it. It was something closer to finally understanding a gift that had been sitting quietly in front of her for 15 years, wrapped in legal language, waiting for a moment she'd never anticipated needing it. He knew, she said quietly. Even sick, even running out of time, he was still trying to protect me from something he couldn't have known would happen. He knew people, Gerald said. He'd built a business from nothing. He'd seen what happens when companies get big enough that the people who actually built them stop matching to the people running the spreadsheets. He wasn't wrong to worry about it. There was more in the file. A letter, sealed, that Anton had left with Gerald specifically to be given to Marlene only if she ever asked to revisit the trust, which she never had until now. Gerald handed it over without a word. Marlene didn't open it there in the office. She folded it carefully and put it in her purse, wanting to be alone when she finally read whatever her husband had wanted to say to her from 15 years in the past, written by a man who somehow, even while dying, had been thinking 3 steps ahead about how to take care of her. She drove home that afternoon a different woman than the one who'd driven in that morning. Dale Prescott had told her the pace of the floor had gotten too fast for her. He had no idea that the floor itself, every square foot of it, answered to her and always had. The letter sat on Marlene's kitchen table for 2 full days before she opened it. She wanted to be steady when she did, and steady took time to find. My Marlene, it began in Anton's cramped, slanted handwriting, the same hand that had signed 1,000 invoices at that kitchen table over the years. If Gerald is giving you this, it means someone finally gave you a reason to ask about the trust, and I'd bet good money that reason wasn't a good one. I'm sorry for that. I built this to protect you from exactly the kind of person who'd never think to ask who really owns the ground they're standing on. I hope you never needed it. I hope somebody out there was smart enough to see what I saw in you every single day for 30 years. If they weren't, go remind them. You've earned the right to. It went on for 2 more pages, most of it not really about the business at all. Small memories. The grain building's leaking roof. The winter they'd nearly lost the whole operation to a canceled contract, and Marlene had personally driven 4 hours to renegotiate it herself while Anton stayed home with the flu. He wrote that he'd never once doubted her, not for a single day of their marriage, and that whatever she decided to do with what he'd left her, sell it, keep it, burn it to the ground for all he cared, he trusted her judgment more than his own. Marlene read it 3 times before she folded it back up. Then she called Gerald and asked him to set up a meeting. Dale Prescott received the calendar invite on a Wednesday morning and didn't recognize the name on it. Kowalczyk Family Trust, requesting a meeting regarding the Redhawk Logistics lease agreement. 10 a.m. Thursday, his own office. He assumed it was a formality, some routine renewal his predecessor had handled without ever looping him in. He told Denise to sit in, mostly out of habit, and didn't think much more about it until Thursday morning, when Marlene Kowalczyk walked through the front doors of the building she'd built with her own hands, wearing a plain gray coat, holding a folder of her own. Dale's face did something complicated when he saw her. Confusion first, then a flicker of the discomfort people feel when they run into someone they've wronged and haven't thought about since. "Marlene," he said, "I wasn't expecting, is everything all right?" "I'm here representing the Kowalczyk Family Trust," Marlene said, and sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. Gerald Whitlock followed her in and took the seat beside her, opening his own folder with the unhurried calm of a man who'd been looking forward to this for a very long time. It took Dale roughly 90 seconds to understand what was happening, and Marlene watched every one of those seconds cross his face. Gerald laid out the documents plainly. The trust, the land, Marlene's name as sole controlling beneficiary since 2009. The lease Ashford Regional had been paying every year to a name they'd never bothered to look into, a lease that, as of this meeting, Marlene had every legal right to renegotiate or terminate, effective in 90 days per the existing terms. "This is a joke," Dale said, though his voice had lost most of its usual certainty. "It's not," Gerald said simply, and slid a certified copy of the trust filing across the desk. Denise, to her credit, read through it fast and quiet, and went pale about halfway down the second page. Dale looked at Marlene like he was seeing her for the first time, which, in a way, he was. Not Mrs. K from receiving. Not the woman who was slowing down. The woman who, on paper, had the power to end his career with a single signature, and had for the entire 8 months he'd spent talking down to her. "Marlene, I think there's been a misunderstanding about how this whole situation was handled," Dale started, the words coming faster now, less rehearsed. "If we'd known your relationship to the property, obviously things would have gone differently. I want you to know that this isn't personal. We were just following the performance metrics that corporate requires us to." "Dale," Marlene said, and something in her voice made him stop mid-sentence. "You told me the pace of the floor had gotten too fast for me. You told a woman who built that floor with her own husband, who worked it for 41 years, that she was too slow to keep up. I'd like you to sit with that for a second before you tell me what wasn't personal." The room went quiet except for the tick of a wall clock that Marlene, absurdly, remembered picking out herself in 2003. "What do you want?" Dale finally asked, and it wasn't a challenge this time. It was closer to something that sounded, for the first time since she'd met him, like fear. Marlene folded her hands on the table. "I want you to call Corwin Ash," she said, "and I want him on a phone in this room in the next 10 minutes. Because what happens to your lease and possibly your job is a conversation I only intend to have once." Corwin Ash arrived at the Thornberry facility 40 minutes later, having driven from the regional office in a state Marlene later heard described, secondhand through Priya, as borderline hysterical. He'd spent most of the drive on the phone with legal, who confirmed within about 15 minutes what Gerald had already laid out plainly on the table. The lease was real. The trust was airtight. Marlene Kowalczyk held every legal right Anton had built into that paperwork 15 years earlier, and none of it could be undone, challenged, or quietly buried. Corwin walked into that glass-walled office already talking, already apologizing before he'd fully sat down. The particular scramble of a man realizing his entire regional footprint depended on the goodwill of a woman his own manager had just fired for slowing down. He used words like unfortunate miscommunication and deeply regrettable oversight. And Marlene let him talk for a while before she said anything at all, mostly because she found she was enjoying, in a way she hadn't expected, watching a man twice Dale's confidence fumble for footing that wasn't there. She didn't terminate the lease. She'd thought about it in the 2 days between the letter and the meeting, thought about what it would feel like to simply end it, sell the land to someone else entirely, watch Ashford Regional scramble to relocate an entire distribution hub on 90 days' notice. Anton would have understood if she had. But that wasn't really who she was, and it wasn't what she wanted the last chapter of this place to be about. Instead, she renegotiated. The lease rate went up substantially, reflecting what Gerald called a more accurate market valuation, which Corwin agreed to without a single word of pushback. She required, in writing, a formal review of Dale's management practices conducted by an outside firm, with particular attention to how performance metrics had been applied across the receiving team. She required her own reinstatement, not as a receiving employee reporting to Dale Prescott, but as a paid consultant to the facility with full access and standing, answerable to no one below Corwin himself. And she required, simply because she could and because some petty satisfaction felt earned, that Dale personally deliver a written apology to every member of the receiving team he'd spent 8 months quietly diminishing. Dale kept his job, technically. Corwin wasn't willing to lose a manager entirely over what internal legal was already calling a liability exposure they wanted contained quietly rather than escalated further. But something in him had changed by the time Marlene walked out of that office. He was quieter around the floor after that. He stopped repeating instructions twice to people who didn't need it repeated once. Whether that came from genuine reflection or simple fear of what she might still do, Marlene never fully decided. And after a while, she found she didn't much care which. Priya got the promotion to full facility operations manager 6 months later, a role Dale had never once considered her for despite her being, by every honest measure, the most capable person on the floor. Marlene made sure Corwin knew exactly who deserved it. As for Marlene herself, she found something in those months she hadn't expected to find at 68, which was a version of purpose that had nothing to do with proving herself to anyone. She still came to Redhawk most mornings, though not at 6 anymore, and not in steel-toed boots either. She walked the floor as something closer to what she'd always secretly been, the person the place actually belonged to. New hires learned her name fast, and learned it with a different kind of respect than the one they'd extended to Mrs. K from receiving. She used part of the increased lease income to start something new on 11 acres at the edge of the property Anton had never developed, a small training center for warehouse and logistics workers over 50, people the industry had quietly started treating as disposable the same way Dale once had her. She called it the Kowalczyk Center, and within its first year, it had trained close to 60 people, half of whom went on to be hired by companies that would never have looked twice at their resumes 6 months earlier. On a cold afternoon in late spring, Marlene stood in the doorway of the old grain building, watching a class of new trainees learn to read a shipping manifest on the same system she'd built by hand in 1994, and thought about Anton, and thought about the letters still folded in the drawer of her nightstand, and thought that maybe, in the end, he'd been right about most things. She'd earned the right to remind people what she was worth. She just hadn't expected it would take losing everything, briefly, to finally do it. If Marlene's story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to learn your worth, let us know in the comments where this story reached you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.